on all the pistons right now, do it now, are pointed towards the flywheel. And as you can see, one arrow there, one arrow there, and they do indeed point towards the flywheel. And likewise on this side here too. Okay, so now next thing to do is install cylinder heads. I like to start with the number 3/4 side. Use the best cylinder head for the number 3/4 side. And you got to tip the engine up to do that and actually rotate things a bit. But now when you rotate the engine, make sure that the pistons, the cylinders, don't slide out far enough to uncover some of the rings. You have to then use the ring compressor to put them back on again. Rotate the engine a bit to where no pistons are top dead center. Put the engine in almost a vertical position here. And now we'll show you how to put the heads on. Assemble the cylinder heads. These are the cylinder heads we just saw having had a valve job. We've enlarged the ports here to take the Solex intake manifolds for the Weber conversions. Put in brand new exhaust and intake valves. We surfaced the cylinder head so it's all nice and clean. And we cleaned up the one cylinder head that had the chunk piston. Apparently this engine had been overhauled twice before, once when it spun a rod bearing on the lower end and once when the piston chunked, probably after it spun the rod. We smoothed that over. We use this on the number 1/2 side, which is under more benign conditions than the 3/4 side. So this is the head we will use on the 3/4 side. We have 8 new pushrod tubes. Note the new ones have the 1-inch extension here that protrude into the case side, not the head side. That's to prevent oil from slinging up into the head through the pushrod tubes and you go around a corner. What we'll do now, you get out our 16, the red ones are the best. These are the seals for the pushrod tubes, little trapezoidal type seals. I like the red ones the best, the green ones the second best, and the black ones the least, but the black ones work fine too. We get out 8 head bolt or head nut O-ring seals here. 2 of the retaining rings are for the air deflectors on both number 3/4 and 1/2 side. And note the air deflectors are somewhat different. That one has a square cutout, one has a oval shaped cutout. Square cutouts for the hex head of the through bolt, and the round cutout is for the acorn nut side. Now note if you put the through bolt in the wrong way, then these air deflectors will not function right. And they are somewhat different, so you do have to put them on the right way, which means you have to put the through bolt on the right way. So what we'll do now is show you how to put the seals on the pushrod tubes. Now since we're putting shims under the cylinders, it's usually best to wiggle and pull on the convolutions here of the pushrod tube, and the big end with the extension gives you more meat to grab onto. We want to enlarge them a little bit so they can compress and therefore seal right. So we take our finger, dip it in the secret sauce, grab a trapezoidal seal, put it over the one side of the pushrod tube, grab another seal, lubricate as we do so. The old big bore kit box serves a good place to store all these things out of the way. And we will then do this on all 8 pushrod tubes. Now we probably won't bore you with showing all 8 pushrod tubes here, but you get the general idea. It's a fairly simple, straightforward thing to do. It doesn't take much time. And the oil is used on the trapezoidal seals simply because it allows them to move around a bit inside. And when you do that, don't forget to expand the pushrod tube slightly here. As I talk, my mouth sometimes gets in the way of my brain. So expand them, make sure they're straight afterwards. Make sure the seal doesn't come off. Get the seal down fairly snugly against things. Now you can reuse use pushrod tubes, but if you ever had a pushrod tube leak on you, and you have to take the cylinder head off to repair it, you won't ever use used pushrod tubes again. You will only use new ones. I've never had a leak so far, knock on wood, with a set of new pushrod tubes. I have seen new pushrod tubes bent where they come from the importers with defects, but you inspect it, inspect the seam, inspect the convolutions, inspect the ends for being bent or whatever. And if they are bent, reject them as they're hard to fix, so they can be fixed. Anyhow, I got all the seals on the pushrod tubes. There are, of course, 8 pushrod tubes, 16 seals. and they go on fairly easily without any problem. Note that the beveled edge goes like so. Don't put it on the wrong way. It's supposed to go against the bevel in the cylinder head. And don't forget the long end, the 1-inch long extension, goes into the case side, not the head side. Okay, now we really should have taken off the head bolt washers, head nut washers, before we plated everything. But if you're careful with a screwdriver, if you're not careful with a screwdriver, you'll end up with stabbing yourself in the hand. You can pry off the old seal. Should have taken these things off before we plated everything. But sometimes in the excitement of doing an engine, or an engine overhaul tape, that you sometimes forget to do the little bitty things. But it doesn't matter if you do get them back after they're plated. The only problem is that these seals can be sometimes very hard and therefore very difficult to remove. When you first take them off the engine, you'll find they're not too terribly hard and they can be removed fairly easily at that time. After they go through the stripping solution, through the plating solution, they usually become very hard and brittle and not very nice to play with. Okay, you take the O-ring seals from the top end gasket set, lubricate them, slide them over, get them into the groove of the wide brim head bolt seal, these type here. The middle head bolts do not have a groove on the earlier engines. On the later 912s, there's a groove on them too for somewhat better support of the stud, alignment really of the stud. This top piece here serves to align the stud in the center, and that does provide for a better stud location. If the stud touches the cylinder, the heat of the cylinder, the temperature of the cylinder, tends to heat the stud up and provide for a weaker, allow the higher the temperature of the iron of the stud, the less the mechanical properties, and therefore it may stretch a bit, and you don't really want to have that happen. So these head bolts are actually designed to align the stud a bit. In fact, we should arrange this, make sure the cylinders are arranged such that the stud protrudes through the hole, the center of the hole, and does not touch any part of the cylinder itself. Okay, we've got the O-ring seals on everything. Grab 2 pushrod tubes that you like. Put on the clips that hold the air deflectors in place. They just snap on. They have a little semicircular piece here. Make sure you put them on the end that has the extension on it, like so. You can get out your blue Loctite. We use blue Loctite on the head bolts, head nuts. Put a drop on each of the head nuts. I've sometimes used red Loctite way back when, and boy, it does work. I mean, those head nuts don't come loose. They pull the studs out of the case before they'll break loose. At least in about half the situations, half the studs. The blue Loctite allows for good torque readings and will maintain everything fairly snugly, but can be retorqued if you have to, and can be broken loose when you want to get the head back off without having the studs come out. The stud does come out. All you have to do is, once you get the nut off of it, take 2 17mm across the flat nuts, kind of the ones that hold your 4 studs in the engine to the transaxle, and double nut them against the stud, put a little red Loctite on the stud where it goes in the case, and then tighten the stud back into the case. Of course, by a stud removal tool, which is very nice, cam-activated device. Snap-on has them, I think, for about $15 or so, that allow you to remove studs very nicely. Okay, now we'll get up and we'll stick everything on here, so be there in a second. Now, how do you want this arranged? Okay, before we install the head, take a rag and go around and clean off the sealing surface of the cylinder of any oil or crud or whatever that might be on it. Usually something, usually oil from where we just installed the pistons and cylinders. Clean off also the beveled area of the case where the pushrod tubes will go in. Get out your secret sauce. Lubricate that bevel area of the head where the pushrod tubes go in. I know we lubricated the washers on the seals on the pushrod tubes, but it helps lubricate that too. Get out one of the push rods, tubes with the spring on it, retaining clip. Get out the air deflector. Do a trial test of fitting the cutout over the through bolt washer. And sometimes you'll find that the case washer will actually touch this edge here, which it's doing in this situation. In that case, take a mill file and just give it a few little touches like that. Do it on both sides. And that will allow it not to touch the washer and to rest a little flatter. You don't want this air deflector to protrude above the side of the cylinder. It may hit the head and prevent the head from sealing right, though I've never really seen that happen. Take your pushrod tube with the spring on it. Make sure the seam, the weld seam, let's get a close-up of this weld seam here, if we can. That weld seam is the most likely place for a leak, so put that up vertically, so even if it does crack or leak or something, it won't really leak. If it's down below, horizontally, it will in fact leak, so keep it vertical. Put it in to the hole. Arrange the spring so the spring fits into the crotch of the air deflector. Push it down like so. Get out 3 more pushrod tubes. Make sure the long extension is into the case and the seam is up. Make sure the seals are installed too. Like there. Get out, since this is the 3/4 side, get out your cylinder head. That's the best one, or better one of the two. Take your secret sauce, lubricate the beveled area in the head where the pushrod tubes will seal. Doesn't take much, just a drop or so per hole. Arrange the head over the studs of the case. Push it down gently. Now arrange all 4 pushrod tubes so they will in fact stick into their appropriate positions in the head. Tap it around a little bit. One thing you should do before you do anything else, of course, is take a magnet, put a magnet down through each of the holes of the head with the head off to make sure there is no washer, head bulb washer, down inside any of the holes. We've done that already. But take a magnet and stick it down with the head off the engine. Otherwise the stud will just grab the magnet. You won't be able to tell. Do it on all 8, but these 4 ones here are the most critical. There's an extra head bulb washer down here, and you put one of the regular head bulb washer on. You have 2 on the same stud. It'll raise the stand out enough to where the valve adjustment goes to hell, and the valve, you have oil leaks, it's a real mess. Anyhow, these are the head bulb washers here now. I like to buy new ones for the lower row and use the used ones on the upper row since they're much less critical. So what you do is you take 4 new head bolt or head nut washers. I like to have the bevel on the top side. Take a screwdriver and play B52 over Moscow, dropping them down the screwdriver. Put the screwdriver on the center of the stud, and then drop the washer down around the stud. Tap it to make sure it's down all the way. Take the 4 used and replated head bulb washers and use them for the top side. Top side less critical, but it's non-trivial, so do use good head bulb washers. The previous clown that rebuilt this engine used A-type case washers, copper case washers, not steel. They're much thinner than the head bulb washers are. They're the wrong ones. He obviously ran out of things and didn't know where to get them. In case you have a problem, let the Maestro know. He'll solve it for you. Get 3 of the wide brim head bolts and 1 of the narrow brim head bolts. 1, 2, 3 wide brim, 1 narrow brim. The brim refers to the diameter here. The arrangement is wide brim goes to the right-hand middle hole, and then the wide brim also goes on either end. The non-wide brim, narrow brim, goes in the left-hand middle hole. It doesn't matter which of these small head bolts you put in the top row. They are all the same. In fact, these head bolts were used for mounting the starter on a 911, so they actually still did use them in the 911 series. Get out your 10mm Allen and your favorite socket wrench. Tighten things down slowly. And you do it in the following order, as I'm doing it here. There's various alternate orders as described in Secrets in Your Circle, and I actually alternate between the alternate orders to make the head torque down evenly without favoritism on one particular side or the other. You don't really torque it down at all here as you're doing this. You're just getting them semi-snug. You then come back to the middle one again, right-hand middle wide brim head bolt, tighten it down some more, go around to all the others in turn. And after this, I'm going to show you a special trick. That special trick will allow your engine heads to seat in much better than normal. I can't take full responsibility for this. I actually got the trick from How to Hot Rod Volkswagen Engines about a long, long time ago. Gee, I hate to admit how long ago that was. But it does seem to work nicely, and I do use it. So you get these things down to about, 10 foot-pounds or so. You make sure that the head bolt seals are sealing, that the head bolt's not sticking out too far or down too far. If it's out too far, it means there's probably another washer hiding down below. If it's in too far, that shouldn't be the situation, unless you left out the head bolt washer. Now here's a trick. Before you torque these things down, rotate the engine and put the head on the 1-2 side. Clean off the top of the cylinder sealing surface. The reason why you want to do this, put on the other head before you torque down the first one, is that way you can alternate the torque between the heads, and as the one head torques down, these studs stretch. And they can actually stretch and distort the case a little bit, and it may affect the other head. If you torque alternately on the head, you'll accommodate that stretch, and they prevent leaks between the head and the cylinder that way. All right, so pardon my movement here. Get out the secret sauce. Pour a little, or take your finger and put a little secret sauce on each of the pushrod tube bevels. Get out the pushrod tube with the air deflector. Check to make sure air deflector will miss that washer. This time it does. We don't have to really cut it out. Make sure the seam is up. It is. Stick everything in place. Get out the remaining 3 pushrod tubes. Seam up in every case, like that. Find the seams. Sometimes there are things that look like seams. They're drawing marks on the tube. They're not seams. The welded seam is fairly obvious once you get to see it. Take your the head that's the less good of the two. Put a little bit of secret sauce on it, on the beveled area where the washers seal. Make sure everything's kosher. Take the head, stick it down over the top of the studs. Arrange the pushrod tubes so they fit through the appropriate hole in the head. Tap it down. Get your screwdriver and the 4 new head nut washers. Play B52 over Moscow. Put the 4 washers over, one to a stud. Tap them down with a screwdriver. Get out the 4 used and replated head nut washers. Put them in. Push them down. Get out the remaining 4 3 wide brim, 3 and 1 narrow brim head nuts. Narrow brim goes on the left of the middle 2. Get out the 4 small head nuts, stick them on the top. Make sure you stick the hex head so it's up so you can get the wrench on it. Snug down the nuts. Look at your pushrod tubes, make sure nothing funny is happening with them. They're all in place. Correctly arranged, seams up. Torque, well, don't torque, just snug down the nuts. Not even tight. Take a couple of passes to do this. You want to creep up on bringing the head into contact with the cylinders so everything is done kind of smoothly and easily. Don't just want to lean on one particular nut to get it all down. You want to bring everything down evenly and happily, like a nice landing on an airplane. You don't want to hit the ground hard. You want to come in for a nice smooth landing. Right. All right, after you've gotten things snugged down, now's a good time to rotate the engine to horizontal position. Get out your torque wrench. Set the torque wrench to 15 foot-pounds initially, and torque in the pattern that's listed in secrets of the inner circle. Like I say, alternate between two torque patterns. If you follow this carefully, you can see which ones they are. You start at the middle and then work your way out to the outer head nuts, like that. Once you reach 15 foot-pounds on this head, go over to the other head. This is the trick. Torque the other head down to 15 foot-pounds. There's going to be a lot of crossing back and forth here, but that can't be avoided. Get to do a little bit of walking around your engine stand when you do it this way. Bring the torque up to 20 foot-pounds. Go back the original side you began with and torque things to 20. Now the factory stock spec for torquing the cylinder heads is 22 foot-pounds. But I found that generally that's not quite enough torque to torque the heads to. So what I like to see is somewhere between 25 and 27 foot-pounds. We've done that side to 20 foot-pounds, now we'll do this side to 20 foot-pounds. You go much beyond 27 foot-pounds, the washer, the head nuts start to strip. I never pull a stud out of a case of a Porsche engine, unlike VWs that pull studs all the time. Porsche case is aluminum, much better, much stronger than the stupid VW magnesium material, except for the new 411 post-1972 buses that the VW made out of aluminum. But I find that about 25 foot-pounds is about as far as you want to go. That's about 10% higher than stock torque. And that seems to work pretty well. The head nuts don't strip. The studs don't strip. The head does not dig in too much to the cylinders like it will if you go much higher than that. And everything seems to work. It's about 10% higher than the factory recommended torque on the head of 22 foot-pounds. I like to use 25 foot-pounds. And that seems to be the happy medium that I've discovered over the years. All right, that's 25 foot-pounds on that side. Come back to number 3 and do it again. Actually, it's the first time for number 3 at 25. After we reach the 25 foot-pound torque, we will repeat the torque 3 times on each head, alternating between heads. Like I say, the Porsche gods like 3 times. Seems to be the magic number of the ancients. And it does seem to work. In fact, I found that the second time through, you sometimes get a few studs that move a little more than you'd expect. Like that one there moved a bit. That one didn't. That one moved just a little. That one didn't. If you keep alternating this torque, you can give it a few minutes between torques too to allow the stud to relax a little bit, if it's going to. And when you do an even torquing pattern like this, it really tends to make the engine run better. Now, I know on American V8s and things, you're supposed to retorque the heads after the engine's fired up. Porsches are very seldom, if ever, retorqued, because you have to take the intake manifold off to get to the top row. A lot of guys would tell you they've retorqued their heads after the engine's been fired up, are probably lying, or else they've just retorqued the lower row, which they can get to by taking the rocker stand off. And retorquing just the lower row may make things worse, not better. So I find if you torque it this way, with the blue Loctite on the nuts, and do it 3 times in succession, that's as good as retorquing after the thing is warm. It really isn't quite, but like I say, nobody retorques these things after they've been fired up. it's too much hassle to take off the intake manifold to get to these, and the cylinder shrouds to get to these top nuts. So we're about done now. I know this isn't terribly exciting, but at least if you do this, you'll have certainly a feeling of accomplishment. And now the engine is reaching its, to me, prettiest stages. Prettiest stages is when the rockers are on, the rocker cover is on, fuel pump and things like that are on, but before the sheet metal is put on. I find that is the nicest mechanical looking aspect of a Porsche engine. Now we have the heads on. If you want to make sure that you've done this job correctly, take the flywheel and spin it over. It'll be a little hard to spin. You can use a wrench on the pulley nut, friction of the rings on the new cylinders. You can put your finger, your thumb, over the cylinder and do a little compression test. And if you do it, it doesn't matter if you're doing it on compression or vacuum. If you do it on vacuum, it sucks. If you do it on compression, it blows because there's no valve operating mechanism. All the valves are closed. And you see how well it can hold vacuum or compression. And as you hear, it does pretty well. Also, by cranking it over, you're making sure that no piston is hitting the head, which it won't with the fixed shim in place. If you want to be certain, you can take a piece of solder, about 1/8 inch solder, put it down through the spark plug hole, crank the engine over, and see how much the solder is compressed when the piston comes up at top dead center. I know you won't have any problem with this. I've checked it before. It will have over 1 millimeter deck clearance between any part of the piston and the head because of the number of shims used and the way that which heads they are. Okay, next step is to put on the rocker train. And again, I like to start with the number 3 side. Number 3 side, I use the best components for, and then the rest of the components, the ones that are second best, go on the number 1, 2 side. That's because number 3 runs the hottest. You want to have the best stuff there. So let me get that set up for you, and we'll be back in a moment. Now we're going to put the rocker stands on. To do that, we need 6 of the 15 millimeter across the flat bolts. These are 10 millimeter bolts. We need special washers. These washers are 10 millimeter washers, but they have a small outside diameter. There are others that have bigger outside diameter, and those washers should not be used. They're kind of like this. The reason why they should not be used is the intake rocker stand will hit the edge of the washer and not sit flat against the stand. We need a 15 millimeter wrench and our torque wrench. Note that there's a little cutout on these, about like so. That's for a pushrod tube to come through. It also tells you which side these things go on. But they only go on one way, because if you didn't put the head bolts in right, you won't be able to get this bolt in. The wide brim head bolts have a tapped area for the 15 millimeter bolts to go in. So you set the better of the 2 rocker stands on the number 3, 4 side. Grab 3 of the bolts, 3 of the washers. Put the washers on the bolts. Put the bolts in. Screw them down a few turns, like so. Get out your favorite little ratchet. I CAD plate these bolts too. You don't have to. You never see them, but I like to CAD plate all the hardware in an engine. It makes for a much better appeasement to the gods. They like to see that too, and they can see in areas where you can't. So it's nice to make them happy. Torque them down to where they're snug. Get out your torque wrench that you just used. Remember, you torqued the head to 25 foot-pounds, and the torque on these bolts is 29 foot-pounds. So it's not far away from the 25. And get out your torque wrench, set the torque to 29. You don't really have to creep up on these, but you can if you want to. 1, 2, 3, helps to check them. 2, 3. At this point, you can flop the engine over to the other side. Put on the other rocker stand. Again, it only goes on one way. And put the remaining 3 10 millimeter bolts in place. 356 normals We use a cast iron stand held only at the outer extremities by a bolt here and a bolt here, and they're 17 millimeter across the flat rather than 15. You can actually use 17s in these two positions, but there's no need to. If you're taking apart the same engine, you should have all the right bolts for it. But if you get some Volkswagen shop that specializes in Porsches, watch out, you can have almost anything in here. Put a 17 millimeter across a flat bolt there, you never get a rocker stand, the intake rocker stand in place. So get them snug, and then get out the torque wrench and torque them down. And now you have installed both intake rocker stands. You can use blue Loctite on these too, but I've really never had one come loose. Crank the engine back over to number 3/4 side and get out your cleaned parts for the benign cleaner. Remember now, we had a couple of rockers that were in fairly, well, they had a few pits on them. They weren't bad. They had a few pits. So you take a mill file, medium mill file, and surface them by doing about 100 strokes this way. Try and pivot the rocker at the same time you're filing to get the same type of curvature the rocker has on it. And after about 10 minutes of this, you'll find that you've actually got a fairly smooth rocker, which we have here, because I've been doing this for a while. These are very hard to machine. You have to have a special jig to machine them. And your local machine shop, I guarantee you, won't have them. I save the old rockers up, and eventually we'll redo all the old rockers when we run out of good used ones, and we have a good supply of them, so it'll be some time. This gives you the idea. And we've already done most of the work here for you, so you don't have to worry. They're now in pretty good shape. So what you do is, helps to use the old big bore kit box. Again, comes in handy for lots of things. You grab a new paper towel, and you grab, say, 4 push rods, or you can use all 8. Can of WD-40, put the WD-40 with the nozzle into the oil hole of the push rod, blow it out until what comes out is clear WD-40. We've cleaned all these things in nice benign cleaner, so they are fairly clean now. You got to blow out the old cleaner and any other crud that exists, make sure the passageways are clean, and that you have a complete connection between one end of the push rod tube and the other. Now a good way to check, set this aside for a moment, the push rods themselves are not bent, is to roll them on a flat surface. If they roll fairly smoothly without the ends describing a circle, they are fairly unbent. They may twist, but they shouldn't roll with the ends describing a circle. These are all pretty good. So we clean them off. Now here's if you have a can of STP or a can of oil, or a bottle of oil, you can let one set in the oil, get some oil up in the push rod, and then pull it out, bring it over quickly, put it down into the push rod tube hole, wiggle till you feel it fall down inside the cam follower. Now don't get it resting on the lip of the cam follower, that's why you want to have the engine vertical. Put another one in the oil can, wiggle it till you feel it fall inside the cup of the rocker. You get the push rod on the edge of the rocker, you'll have a heck of a time adjusting the valve, and then when you do adjust the valve, it'll probably plop down inside the rocker at some point, and all of a sudden your valve gap will become about 1/4 inch. Not quite, about 1/8 of an inch, but you get the idea. Clean them off, dip them in the oil, let some oil get up inside the push rod. It'll probably run out anyhow, but at least it gives you a psychological feeling of doing the right thing. Put it in like so. Okay. Now to deal with the rockers themselves, these other 4 push rods we'll deal with when we go to the other side. What we do is we take a rocker, this is an exhaust rocker, clean it off, take some WD-40, stick the nozzle into the adjustment screw nozzle and blow. And you'll see the oil, WD-40, come out the inside of the rocker. Blast it all off really nicely. Now there should be a little oil hole here, right, like so. If we're lucky, we'll even see some oil coming out of there, some WD-40 coming out of there. This oil hole squirts oil onto the intake valve spring area. And you should make sure they're open, like so. Now the factory, when they did an engine, a new engine, left these open and told the dealer to plug these after the engine broke in, because otherwise you can sometimes throw too much oil on the intake valve spring and cause complaints of smoking from the customer. I like to use only open oil hole rockers. I find it works better. It may smoke a little more after a while when the valve guides wear, but so what? It's not too terrible. And it lubricates things. So you set that aside and you go the next one, do the same thing with it. Blast it all out all over. Make sure the oil hole is open as best you can. Okay. Clean it off and set it aside. Now the long rockers, the ones we just did, go one to a side. These are the short exhaust rockers. The other long exhaust rockers are used one to each side, like I was saying. The short exhaust rockers also have an oil hole there. There we go, now it's clear. And the exhaust rockers are generally in pretty good shape, though occasionally they do pit too, or they'll score on the inside. But these are all fairly decent. The intake rockers, here's one we treated. You do the same thing. Blast it out. You can rotate the adjustment screw usually sometimes to get better angles on things. Clean it all out really well. This is a rocker we reconditioned. We'll put that on the number 1-2 side. We use the good rockers on the 3-4 side. So you blast them all off. This is a good rocker, unpitted. We'll save that. We'll put that on the 3-4 side that we're doing now. This other one is also a good rocker. We'll put it on the 3-4 side too. Look at the rocker shafts, intake rocker shafts. Pick the one that's the better of the two. And I think this one here is the better of the two. You look at the shaft, not the middle aluminum piece. Okay, and we'll grab this. You arrange it in front of you so that the short end, there's a short end here and a long end, so the short end's on your left-hand side. Helps to do this where you won't worry about getting crud on things. And you get out 2 shims, 2 springs, clean them off. The right arrangement is washer, spring, washer. Get out another spring. There's a washer already on there. So it goes washer, spring, washer, and the intake rocker. But before that, we put a little dab of our secret sauce on both sides. Take the intake rocker, stick it over, make sure it spins freely. If it doesn't, try the other rocker stand. Like so. Maybe tight getting on, but once it's on, it should spin freely. Now another shim and cap, one of the caps. Put the cap on. You sometimes have to tap it with something. Your hand usually works. Put another shim on this side and a cap on this side. Take the rocker, set it over the studs, push on the caps inwards, rotate a little bit, wiggle, rotate. Get the cups of the rocker adjustment screws over the push rods. Push it down. Go to the better of the 2 short exhaust rockers. This one here is pretty good. Get out the best of the short rocker shafts. That one there is pretty good. Clean it off. Now if there are score marks on it, we're going to rotate it so a new virgin area is going to be used as the bearing surface. Again, the arrangement is washer, spring, washer. These are shims actually. Secret sauce, short rocker with the adjustment end towards you. Right. Okay, do the long one then. Let's try this one. We'll find this buddy yet. This is why it really helps put everything together so that this is probably the hard one. The one that's very difficult getting off. It's difficult getting on too. We can use the same technique though as before. Put it on. They're usually distorted from people over clamping the nuts that hold the rocker to the rocker shaft. And that's why we're having some difficulty here. So what we do is take the next best rocker. There's the next best rocker. Goes shim, spring, shim, secret sauce. See if this one goes on a little better. Tap, 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 tap. Okay, we'll get out our special installer and our special tool necessary for doing installation. Tap it a few times. Once it gets beyond the point of distortion here, then it goes on very well and spins very nicely. Make sure that the area that's worn is up on top facing you, like so. Put the other washer and the cap on. You can tap those too to get them on. Do a triple check on the crud, or any score marks here. Make sure there's no crud. Make sure the rocker rotates fairly freely. And the exhaust rockers, the short ones, only go on this side. I mean, one to a side. Put the cup in, like so. We'll deal with the long exhaust rocker now. Find out which exhaust rocker wants to go through. Looks like the previous clown before us really torqued these things down. There we go. We'll use this one, clean it off. It goes, again, shim, wash, spring, shim, spring, shim, secret sauce, exhaust rocker. And again, we may have to use our technique, like so. And again, once it goes in, it usually stays in. Occasionally the other end will come off. Now it's really slippery. So just put the cap back on. No big deal. Get another shim. Clean everything off. Another cap. Little love tap. And put this one on. This is the exhaust rocker for, in this case, number 3 cylinder. A few taps with your hands usually to align it. Sometimes that doesn't work, so you have to take it off and realign it. There we go. Put the cup in. Okay, now we go and get the saddle washers, the special saddle washers to fit over the intake rocker stand and the stand here, and the special nuts, and I'll show you them. Be here in a second. Okay, take the special saddle-shaped washer, put over the rocker arms like so. There are 6 of these special saddle-shaped washers on each side, 12 total. And then the same type of washer, regular washer, spring washer, that's used on the third piece, a smaller OD style 8mm washer, is used on top of the saddle washers. And then very special thin 8mm nuts with standard thread. These nuts are different than the valve adjustment nuts. And though the valve adjustment nuts look the same, they're very close, they are not the same. So don't use the valve adjustment nuts on the rocker for the rocker tie downs. Now, there's one place where you can get away with the big washer and the big regular 13mm nut. That's right here in the middle of the intake rocker stand. And actually the big nuts, regular 13mm nuts, will work, but factory use these thin ones. And I think you should also use these thin ones too. You must not over torque these thin ones or they will fail. That's why I like to use a wrench on them. You can torque them down to between 15 and 18 foot-pounds, but I think you're much better off going closer to 15 than you are towards 18. They tend to strip out at about 18 or so. So on the intake rocker stand, it's kind of best usually to torque down the middle nut and then go over to the outside ones and torque them down evenly. If you do one of the outside ones first and an intake rocker happens to be open, then you can put kind of undue stress on the rocker stand, etc. So we tighten these down. We'll do both sides and we'll run through with the torque wrench at about 15 foot-pounds on all of these nuts. Get this one down here. You can, by cranking the engine over, get all the valves on one side so none of them are open or beginning to open. And that way you can torque all these down without fear of having to torque also the valve spring, which can really be a chore to do. So you get them all snug. You also make sure that the rockers hit the valve slightly off-center. The purpose of that is to allow the valve to rotate. When the rocker opens it, if it hits it slightly off-center, it'll induce a torque causing the valve to rotate as it opens. And that's supposed to be better than having the valve not rotate when it opens. All right, now we'll go to the other side. And don't forget now, we have to put the push rod. Torque wrench to 15 foot-pounds, and then torque all the nuts to 15. Now occasionally you'll strip a nut, especially a nut that's been CAD plated. The smaller, thin 13mm nuts tend to strip a lot. So if you do CAD plate these, you should have a few extras just in case, and these are special. Though like I say, in an emergency you can use a regular 13mm nut. But if you're careful and torque them carefully and don't over torque them, they'll be okay. That's that side. And now we can do this side. I like to do both sides at once. That way you don't forget things. Come on, baby, that's it. All right, once they're all torqued down, which with a little bit of luck, they will be, we can then go to the valve adjustment, which is next. All right, we're going to adjust the valves, and a neat trick on how to adjust the valves, how to find top dead center and all is as follows. Watch the intake valve spring of number 1 cylinder, and this is the intake valve spring of number 1 cylinder, so watch this as I crank the engine over. Eventually, the intake valve spring will open. There it goes now. Pretty much fully compressed now. Now it's backing off. Bring it back to where it's just about off again. There's some gap. Then come to the pulley. And you'll see at this point that the OT for top dead center, OT could be German for on top, oben toppen or something. Keep cranking clockwise, and the OT mark will come up to the top eventually as you crank. Get it to the top, and now we're at top dead center on compression ignition on number 1 cylinder. Now what we do is with a 13mm wrench and a decent screwdriver, we go over here, wiggle the valves. One has a lot of gap, one has almost none. So we first start on the exhaust, loosen it up to where we have some gap. And then you can use one of 3 techniques here, the imprisoned feeler gauge method with a feeler gauge imprisoned here. Memorize slot location, where you memorize the position of the slot here as you adjust it. or the calibrated arm. And for an initial valve adjustment, I'll show you the calibrated arm technique. You can screw it down to where the screw gets tight and there's no gap, and back it back about 1/8 of an inch, 1/8 of a turn actually. Wiggle it. You can feel that's too tight. Back it a little bit more. That's just about right. You can actually see about 6/1000ths. We'll check these with these feeler gauge, of course, to make certain. But if you've done this enough times, you can get the feel of what a 6/1000th gap should be like. And just to show you how close I can come, I'll first adjust it by hand and then use the feeler gauge on it and check it that way. All right, intake valve the same way. Now, during break-in, or when you first fire the engine up, it is much better to have the valves too loose than too tight. And I found that about 7 or 8/1000ths on both the intake and the exhaust is the best way to fire up a new engine. That way you're assured of having sufficient gap on both valves. And after the initial oil change at 30 miles, 300 miles, and 1200 miles, after each oil change you go back and readjust the valves, creeping up on the correct adjustment each time. Correct adjustment is 4/1000ths, saith the book, on the intake and 6 on the exhaust. But I like to use 5/1000ths on the intake and 6 to 7 on the exhaust. Now, if you have alloy cylinders, which we don't, we have cast iron cylinders, the factory reversed these setting where they had 6/1000ths on the intake and 4 on the exhaust. But I never like to see 4/1000ths on the exhaust, much rather see 6. And the intake, if you have 4 or 6, doesn't make a hell of a lot of difference. So I like to adjust the intakes to about 5 and the exhaust to 6 or 7. So anyhow, we will adjust this, and that seems to be about right. A little bit on the loose side on that one. But we'll readjust these things after fire up. Crank the engine 180 degrees counterclockwise so we can do number 2 cylinder, and then the OT mark will be down at the bottom. In fact, if you note, with a 4-hole pulley, there's a hole opposite. Here's the OT mark. There's a hole opposite the OT. You can either make a little notch or just line the timing mark of the case up with the middle of the hole that's opposite the hole where the OT is. Okay, and then go and do number 2 cylinder. And again, here we have an intake that's tight and an exhaust that's loose. Back off the intake till you get some gap. Get the nut up against the adjustment. Wiggle back and forth. Tighten down the nut. Use your calibrated arm. Yeah, it's not too bad. We'll check these, like I say, with a real feeler gauge and see how close we've come to the actual gap. But I found that when you play with these for a long time, you can get real close with a calibrated arm. If you're out in the boonies someplace and you have a problem or the valves get tight for some reason, you got no feeler gauge, you'll have to use your calibrated arm. So it comes in handy for many things. Like if the batteries fail on the calculator these days, people just don't know how to add, subtract, multiply, or divide. Those of us who are raised on slide rules and the multiplication division tables will find that you're at a big advantage sometimes and their calculator batteries go out. Okay, get the number 2 cylinder done. Crank the engine counterclockwise again until this time the OT mark comes up and aligns with the notch in the 3rd piece. You can rotate the engine stand and then go off and do number. Okay, now we're going to see just how well the Maestro did by his calibrated arm. You get out feeler gauges that span the range in 1,000 increments from 4 to 8, so that's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8/1000ths. You make sure it's top dead center on number 1. The OT mark should be up. There should be valve gap on number 1 cylinder, which there is. Take the 4/1000ths feeler gauge, feed it in the intake, it fits in. Likewise on the exhaust. Take 5. 5 is getting somewhat snug. Not snug there. 6 is pretty snug. So the gap on the intake is 6/1000ths. Gap on the exhaust is going to be more than 6. 7 doesn't go in. The intake valve gap is 6. And 7 barely goes in here. Will 8 go in? No, 8 will not, unless you force it, go in. So exhaust gap is 7, intake gap 6. For break-in, that's fine. For normal adjustment, I like to see 6 or 7 on the exhaust and 5 or so on the intake. So the Maestro's calibrated arm is still calibrated. Check number 2. Crank the engine counterclockwise, 180 degrees, till the OT mark is down at the bottom. In fact, there's a circle up here at the top on the 4-hole pulley the topmost part of the circle lined up with the notch in the case is also 180 degrees out, or top dead center on number 2 cylinder. Go over the number 2 cylinder, intake and exhaust, put the 4 in, it fits in through both. The 5 is a little more snugly on the intake, but no problem on the exhaust. The 6 is tight on the intake, no problem on the exhaust. 7 won't go into the intake. So the intake gap here is 6. The exhaust gap is 8. All right, so he's off by 1/1000th of an inch on the exhaust valve gap. So we'll correct that. Bring it back down to 7 or so. You loosen the rocker, the adjustment lock nut on the adjustment screw. That's going to be too tight. So you binary search on the slot position. That's still going to be too tight. So a little more that way. That's probably going to be too loose, so we'll check it out and see. 5 fits in, 6 fits in, well, let's go all the way up to 8. 8 fits in, so that's too loose. So now memorize the slot location there. Loosen it, bring it back clockwise like there. Tighten it down, feels better. Try 8. 8 won't go in. 7 will go in. 6 goes in easily, yes. The gap's about 7, that's where you want to be. Do the same thing, crank it counterclockwise again for the number 3/4 side. Bring the OT mark back up on top dead center. It's top there bring the OT mark back up to match the notch in the 3rd piece. That's top dead center in number 3 cylinder. We can go over there and redo that. Check the gap. Make sure it's about 6 to 8 thousandths on both the intake and exhaust valve for fire up. We won't do that now. We've already done it. So next thing now is to put the valve covers on. And for the valve cover, best thing to use that I have found through a multitudinous experience is the 3M Super Weather Stripping Adhesive. It's also known lovingly in the trade as Gorilla Snot because it has the look and consistency of what Gorilla Snot might actually look like. Okay? Take and wipe off the initial stuff that comes out of the tube, and then lay a bead, blows bubbles too, about 1/8 of an inch wide, all the way around. This takes some skill in squeezing the tube while you also maneuver the nozzle around. And usually after the first one you get better at it. Go over any area that has not enough, stringy. Let it set for a few minutes. Do the other one. The curves are what the killers are here. Like so. Always put the cap back on immediately or you'll have to use a nail to unplug it. While it's giving a few seconds there, get your other bail out, CAD plated bail. Put it in the other side here. Okay. Take your WD-40 can and spray the valve springs, etc. If you're going to be firing the engine up, you can use WD-40. If you're going to be firing the engine up quickly, you can use WD-40. If you're going to be keeping it for a long time, pour oil on everything here. Spray both halves, both heads, around the valve springs, the valves, the rockers, etc. Now come back to your valve train, or your rocker covers here. Put the valve cover gasket in place. Now that the 3M snot has had a chance to evaporate.